What are the best advanced combat tips in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Which ones are they? And are these tips advanced or just the stuff your GM hopes you never figure out? I'm so sorry forever GMs out there. This is the Dominomicon, authored and hosted by me, Dominic. The Dominomicon is dedicated to all nerdy things, with my current obsession being the TTRPG Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In this video chapter, I'm going to go over what I believe are the top 5 advanced combat tips for Pathfinder 2e. I already did a video talking about combat tips, which I'll link to now, and while this one is not a direct follow-up, it probably helps if you've seen that video. Hopefully these tips will drive your GM insane, and I know they will because as a forever GM myself, these are the exact advanced combat strategies that are being used against me, and I hate my groups for them. If you find this video chapter helpful and or enjoyable, please give it a like and consider subscribing, joining as a member, or taking a look at my Patreon. I really do appreciate the support. Before we properly begin, this video is sponsored by Paleo Games and the genuinely fantastic book, Dr. Drolin's Dictionary of Dinosaurs, and yep, that's a first for this channel, which is pretty darn cool if I say so myself, and clearly I do. I've actually mentioned these guys before in my third-party spotlight video after they sent me a copy as a gift, but having dug through it, I was impressed enough to happily feature them again here. This is a 300+ page behemoth with Foundry and Path Builder support, 50+ dinosaur stat blocks with true-to-life special abilities, new ancestries, a druid subclass, magic items and consumables, and it's all well-researched, balanced, and paired with fantastic art plus sources for all the non-fictional stuff in there. I'd never recommend something I genuinely didn't like or use myself, and for this one, it's both. This is honestly one of the best third-party supplements I've seen for Pathfinder 2e, legitimately. If you're curious, check the pinned comment and get 10% off using my discount code DOM10, or take a look at my earlier spotlight video for more details on the book itself. Alright, enough faff, let's position ourselves for an easy crit and start the music. Okay, as ever, this list will be in no particular order, and I'm just going to rattle off all the best strategies that have been used lovingly against me as a forever GM. Like I said, I apologize to all GMs out there who have players that see this video and that their games are somewhat ruined. Okay, due diligence done, here we go. I really cannot express how unbelievably encounter ruining for the GM difficult terrain can be. It's one of those things that when I started running this system, I didn't care all that much about, but my players have since used it against me to incredible effect, and now I hate it with a burning passion. Just before I explain what difficult terrain is and why it's so powerful, remember one thing when looking at all the combat tips within this system. Actions are everything. If you can cost the enemy their actions, you win at the game. It's pretty much as simple as that. Also make the HP go to 0 because that helps as well. So difficult terrain basically halves your movement when you're moving onto it or through it. So if your movement is normally 30 feet, it's suddenly 15 feet. And remember, movement is actions. First of all, obviously this makes sense to do against enemies that are far away from you, especially if your initiative is higher than theirs at the start of a fight, or you have a lot of ranged characters who could just pelt them with ranged attacks while they struggle through that difficult terrain. So while they're struggling, they are losing actions. And if you take a look at spells such as Entangling Flora or Cave Fangs, you start to see how powerful this can be because the area is pretty large, which means they've got to go all the way through that area. And while Cave Fangs comes with the same amount of damage as a Fireball, which is awesome, Entangling Flora is even more powerful than that in my opinion, because every time they start their turn, they have to make that reflex save, and if they fail, they take a further penalty to the speed, which means that they're barely going to be able to move at all. This is simply going to cost them many actions, which is potentially encounter destroying. I've said it many a time before, a lot of the more powerful creatures in PF2E tend to have 2 or 3 action combos, and if they're having to spend an extra action to move into place, then they've just lost that ability entirely for that turn. And aside from some of the extra special effects that some of these spells and abilities do, there is no saves for difficult terrain. It is just difficult terrain, and now your movement is halved. Another cool tip, if you have any characters that have the reactive strike ability, you can force the enemy to stride instead of step, which is going to trigger that reactive strike. Just think of situations like an enemy wanting to move out of an off-guard position because they're flanked by 2 of your allies, but instead of being able to step out the way, they now have to stride. And consider combining abilities that force difficult terrain with abilities that slow down movement. So you can throw a Cave Fangs out there and deal some damage, and then there's difficult terrain, and then combine that with Tangle Vine. It only works for a round, but when you heighten it to 2nd, which happens automatically because it's a counter, remember, it lasts for 2 rounds, and heightened to 4th, it lasts for a minute, which is kind of ridiculous. You could potentially shut down most of an encounter if just a couple of your allies had difficult terrain spells or abilities, plus a couple of Tangle Vines. Not to mention casting this on enemy spellcasters. Instead of them being able to pretty easily get in range for a perfect 2-action spell, they may have to spend multiple actions just getting into to that range, which then means they cannot cast that 2-action spell. There's also a few feats and abilities out there to make difficult terrain even worse for enemies, such as Nature's Edge at level 9 for Ranger and Terrain Advantage for the Lizard Folk that makes enemies off guard once they're on difficult terrain. There's so many situations where difficult terrain can completely ruin an encounter. It's not going to be every encounter, but there's a good chunk of them where it's going to do something pretty significant. I cannot believe I slept on difficult terrain for so long, and you definitely should not be sleeping on it anymore because it's possibly one of the most powerful things you can do in this entire system. Absolutely try to get yourself some abilities that give you difficult terrain because it's just phenomenal, and I hate it with all my heart. Next up, before I start crying. Honestly, this list may as well just be the top 5 things that Dominic hates as a GM. Concealment ruins my life sometimes. I'm not joking, and one of my groups can confirm this. The other day, I had 2 natural 20s against the tank character, and because he had concealment, they both rolled and failed that flat check, and honestly, I've been crying every day ever since. Though that's for multiple reasons, to be honest. If you are concealed, whenever an enemy hits you directly, they have to make a DC 5 flat check to see whether or not they even manage to use the action properly. That DC 5 may not seem like that much, because it kind of isn't, but that's still a 25% chance that they completely miss you and lose an action. One of the easiest ways to accomplish this is with the spell Blur. It's only rank 2 and lasts a whole minute, and you're just basically concealed, and a spellcaster can cast this on themselves, or they can cast it on you, which is lovely. But even better than that is abusing spells such as Darkness. This creates a shroud of shadows that stops all light from working inside it, and light cannot penetrate the pure darkness. This means that basically everyone is concealed inside that area unless they have dark vision. And if you or your allies happen to have dark vision and the enemy for whatever reason does not, then suddenly your allies in the area are concealed and the enemy is not. And when this is heightened to 4th, they need greater dark vision to be able to see through that, which is incredibly rare. Mist also works pretty well, though it's more specific on how it works, but definitely consider scenarios where you're getting attacked by ranged enemies. You just pop one of these down and you don't really have to worry about that as much anymore because of that 25% chance of them to miss entirely. And it's going to come up time and time again. It might only be 25% chance, but trust me, it comes up all the time and it drives me mad. So yeah, this is definitely an advanced combat tip because it's not going to be useful all the time and you have to be really clever about how and when you use it. There's also plenty of different ways to gain concealment with things like Cloak of Shadows, for example, as a focus spell, which is pretty awesome. The Fey Bloodline for Sorcerer gets concealment every time you cast a Bloodline spell, which is amazing. The Psychic can get it as well with the Wandering Reverie, and there's the Smoke Ball 2, which basically anyone can have. There's a bunch of relatively easy ways to gain concealment, and it's absolutely going to make the difference in a tough fight. And remember, enemies completely missing those swings is better than any AC or any damage resistance or anything else out there, because they just lose the action entirely. Right, moving on to less rage-inducing things for the GM. Consumables are honestly not all that well used in PF2E, aside from stuff like healing potions, etc. I think people look at the cost of consumables and just think, oh, I'll sell it instead. And there's a lot of people just don't like wasting them. I totally understand that. I'm one of those players in video games that will hoard 100 healing potions and use like 2 or 3 on the last boss and then feel bad about it. Funnily enough, that's kind of how you should use them here, in that you should use them in tough encounters. The money is nice, but honestly, it's not all that much. They're relatively inexpensive, and they can make the difference in a very difficult battle. As already mentioned, of course, there are potions of healing, elixirs of life, etc. They're all really good. However, the Soothing Tonic is probably better than a healing potion outside of combat because it gives you fast healing 1 for a whole minute, which is 10 HP guaranteed. Then there's stuff that can increase your saving throws, like Anti-Plague. They're going to be useful in a pinch. There's certain mutagens that work really well. They're very specific, but do keep an eye out for them. The Drakeheart mutagen, I've heard, is good for strength-based monks. But the most advanced part of this particular section is talismans, because no one seems to use them, and that in itself makes them advanced, sort of. There are like a quadspillion amount of talismans out there, so I can't really go over all of them. I'll just list a few that I think are really cool. Maybe I'll do a top 20 consumable items video chapter at some point. One of my players mentioned the Retrieval Prism. You sort of attune an item to it and you can call it to yourself for free action. It's got to be 1 bulk or less, but still it could be pretty awesome in certain scenarios, especially if you get disarmed or you get ambushed and you're not ready and on your weapons are anywhere near you, etc. I really like potency crystals because you basically turn your weapon into 1 potency and striking rune higher than you would have at that level, all for free action when you make an attack. Again, you're probably not going to use this in normal encounters, but when you're fighting a particularly tough enemy, wait until the right scenario, like the enemy's flanked or he's demoralized or has sickness or whatever, and then boom, make a strike with a potency crystal. Turn that crit into a mega crit. The Grim Trophy is cool as well, yet somewhat costly, but the situations where you're going to want to do it, especially when you're in a very challenging encounter against multiple enemies. Of course, explosives are very useful in the right scenarios. Alchemist Fire against creatures that are weak to fire is just awesome, and the Bottled Lightning is just incredible, because if you hit hit the enemy is just off guard, and that's that. This is very good for assisting ranged allies, as it's kind of hard to get enemies off guard when you're ranged, but if you use this, they just are. The Dread Ampule is awesome as well. When you hit the Frightened one, and that's just that. Obviously, this is a lot more useful if you have an alchemist in the party, but you can still buy these and use them every now and then to help yourselves out. There's also snares, which I barely ever see used, and they are actually really good. Even the Spike Snare at level 1 is 2d8 piercing damage with a relatively high-ish saving throw. Like, that's actually pretty genuinely good. The Boom Snare at level 4 is 2d6 fire and 2d6 sonic damage, and on a fail, they're deafened for 1d4 rounds, and they take 1d4 persistent damage. That's quite a lot for a little snare you could just pop down. Definitely don't sleep on snares as part of your consumables, because some of them are really good. Just imagine putting them down in front of a door and then making a loud sound to draw the enemies out, or put them down a narrow corridor or something. You'd have like multiple in a row. So just keep an eye out for some of the amazing consumables in this system. They're potentially life-ending and encounter-changing in the right hands. I honestly wish I could go on and on, but let's move on to the next tip. I could also go on and on about how good skill actions can be, and I have done in 2 previous videos actually, which will be linked on screen right now, but here I am going to go on about them again, and that's just because of how good they actually are. But on top of this is 2 little extra points which turn this into more advanced versus generic combat tips. The first is picking the order in which you do these skill actions. I've seen too many players choose to demoralize at the wrong time. Realistically, you probably want to do this as soon as possible, preferably before you start to attack the enemy or cast your spells at it, etc. That sounds obvious, but the issue is demoralize becomes a bit of an afterthought once people have burned 1 or 2 attacks already, so try to do it initially. It just makes more sense to do it straight away. But also try to keep in mind that if your target's turn is immediately next after you in the initiative, it might actually be worth delaying. It's a risky maneuver, certainly, but if you demoralize after they've taken their turn, your party has a whole turn to capitalize on that demoralize, and the enemy will still be taking that -1 to their attack rolls on their next turn. So yeah, think when to use demoralize, because it's awesome if you do it right. And here's another thing that's awesome: grappling. Granted, you have to be a particular build for it and have the free hands, etc., and if they're a large enemy, you need Titan Wrestler, yada yada yada, but still, grapple is incredibly strong, and I have mentioned it before, it's the ultimate tank tactic in my opinion, because it means they have to spend an action escaping, which is going to give them the multiple attack penalty, or they just have to carry on hitting you. Either way, you are effectively tanking. But I've said all this before, so what's particularly advanced about grappling? Well, what if you tried tripping them as well? If the enemy is grabbed and tripped, when it's their turn, they're not able to stand up without escaping from you first. That's because when an enemy is grabbed, they are immobilized, which stops them from using any actions that have the move trait, which includes stand. So they are literally pinned on the ground in a cuddle party situation, though one with swords, knives, and maces and stuff, so maybe not so much of a party, although I guess it depends what you're into. That also means that if they do want to attack, because of the prone condition, they're taking a -2 on all their attack rolls, and if they use acrobatics or athletics as part of their escape attempt, they gain the attack trait, which means they take the -2 to that as well. So they kind of need to escape first, and then they can actually try standing up, which is going to give them multiple attack penalty and cost them an extra action, and they might fail. And yeah, it's probably going to cost you 2 actions also, but as I've said a million times, enemies have combos, and if you can stop the 2 or 3 action combo with just some of your actions, it's basically always worth it. Never mind triggering reactions from your fighter or any of the other party members that have reactive strike, because bear in mind, a lot of martials can get at level 6. Seriously, more PCs need to grab reactive strike at level 6, because it's just amazing in this system. It's a mapless attack, which is very rare. Then there's shove, more situational but could be useful, like shoving an enemy into a hazard like a snare, or off a cliff, or shoving them out of a flanking position for an ally, or keeping them away from spellcasters if the enemy themselves has a form of reactive strike. And again, if you're good at demoralize, do that first before doing any of these actions, depending on initiative order, etc. It's just going to be easier to pull these off. I've not even mentioned getting a critical success on a grapple attempt. That's just utterly encounter destroying, because they're completely stuck. They cannot do anything until they escape. Unbelievably strong. So yeah, try to think about skill actions in combinations with each other and other abilities, rather than just singular things that you can do. Always consider what your teammates can do and try to utilize their skill actions and abilities the same as your own. Okay, last advanced combat tip I have for you. In PF2E, actions mean everything, and I said so at the start of this video chapter, and this means that if you find ways to break the action economy, well, you win. Well, maybe not 100% of the time, but it really does help. First of all, you can grab spells like Haste, which gives you an extra action just for Strike and Stride, and hey, an extra action is an extra action. You can grab the Potion of Quickness once you get to around 8th level, though you can buy it earlier. That gives you the effects of Haste for 1 minute. And the Exemplar, for example, gets the Horn of Plenty as one of their potential icons, which allows you to get that potion for free. So one of the reasons this is so powerful, in my opinion, is because if you are quickened at the start of a fight and the fight lasts for 3 rounds, that means you've just gained an extra turn. But you don't need quicken to give yourself an extra action. First of all, mounts exist. When you have a mount and you give it the mature animal companion feat, they get 1 extra action per turn to do something like strike or stride. So they get to stride for you for free, and if you're mounted on your animal companion, then they move for free while you are on top of them, and generally animal companions have better movement than you do. And they can attack too. It's kind of ridiculous how powerful animal companions are. As for the unmounted animal companions, they're still really good. It's 1 action to give them 2 actions, which is effectively kind of like giving yourself 4 actions per turn. And remember, they can not only body block, but they can create choke points, they can flank, and they can attack on top of that. Yeah, they don't have amazing stats, but they do pretty well. Some of them have support actions depending on your class, etc. Animal companions are just so good in this system. Summons can be really good as well, depending on which particular summon you choose, like the famous unicorn that can freaking heal. That means you're spending 1 action after the initial summon to get them to do a 2-action heal, which is a little bit silly. There's also plenty of other ways to break the action economy, with things like Flurry of Blows or Hunted Shot or Defensive Advance. These actions are action compression, and action compression equals power because it gives you more actions to do other things. Here's another 2, Sudden Charge and Scout's Charge, both amazing action compression abilities. There's plenty of them out there, just keep an eye out for them. They tend to have the Flourish trait, so you're going to use 1 per turn, which kind of makes sense. And as ever, imagine combining that with some of the stuff I've already mentioned. Combining action compression with haste and with an animal companion gives you a stupid amount of actions per turn. And I can't believe I'm going to do this. I'm going to compliment the summoner. They get an Eidolon, which effectively gives you 4 actions per turn. And then when you get tandem actions, that kind of becomes 5 actions per turn. Combine that with haste and with an animal companion and action compression, and you get like 6, 7, maybe even 8 actions per turn, which is just ridiculous. Okay, yeah, it probably won't be 8 actions, but you get my point. These sorts of actions don't just add damage or effects, they add turns to your character, and that's why they're so powerful. And I think that's enough ways to make your GM cry for 1 video chapter. I did have a runner-up tip, which is to use the terrain to your advantage, but not all GMs allow for that sort of terrain-based gameplay. But if you happen to have one of those maps and your GM allows for it, just imagine things like creating choke points in corridors or like surrounding a door, making sure no one can get through. If you start a fight on top of a tree, for example, enemies need to climb to get to you. Generally, that's going to cost them a lot of actions. Then you can do things like move furniture to block off entrances and stuff. There's plenty of things you can do to use the terrain to your advantage. You just got to make sure your GM is cool with it. And honestly, a lot of the Paizo APs don't tend to have that many maps that have these sorts of things in them, so that can be tricky as well. But anyway, that is enough advanced combat tips to give you a pretty certain edge in combat. As ever, try to combine these things together for unbelievable strength on the battlefield. Aside from like recall knowledge and flanking your enemies, I think combining abilities is probably the best advice you could give to anyone in this system. If you have any advanced combat tips, please let me know in the comments. There are quite a lot of combat strats, as I call them, in this system, and I do love hearing from you guys and informing me of some of the crazy things you come up with. Also, if you have any amazing talismans, please link them as well. Just try not to upset your GM too much with these things, because you know you're going to be first on the chopping block. Wink, wink. I'd like to quickly mention my sponsor again, Paleo Games, with Dr. Droland's Dictionary of Dinosaurs. Please check it out and maybe grab my 10% discount. I genuinely think that we as a community should be supporting third-party creators if we can, so we can get more and more awesome content for PF to be. And I genuinely think Paleo Games' first book is exactly that. If you found this video chapter helpful and or enjoyable, please give it a like and consider subscribing, joining as a member, or taking a look at my Patreon, or even sharing it with some of your bestest friends. And I'd like to thank my members and archivists, Max Magnus 20019, Ozzy Smith, Shard, Sirakia, Nikola Milenkovic, Kyle Travis, and patrons and archivists Clash and Q. Your support always means the world to me. But for now, this is Dominic of the Dominimi Nomicom, wishing you a fond farewell, and until next time, goodbye.